Good morning, everybody. It's good to be back again for this next session, transforming your reality through shifting the way you think. There's a couple things I want to talk about today, but the overarching premise is that each of us through childhood development have learned certain patterned behaviors, and we're almost helpless to break out of those patterns to learn something new. We coin a lot of phrases in our society like thinking out of the box and thinking strategically, thinking entrepreneurially, but all the while we really don't have the physiological ability to do so. So we erect different things around us to assist us and to help us in that. And we're going to cover what those are today. But I'm going to approach this subject in this way. I'm going to first prove that we do think in these patterns. I want to review that and I want to talk about why. And then I want to look at some strategic ways to break us out of that pattern thinking. So again, I'm not going to go back into it in depth, my assumptions. I am going to cover that because these will be independently put up on the web, but I'm going to cover it quicker than I covered it in our earlier session. Here are my assumptions for this talk. Number one, you're big boys and girls and you can handle frank conversations and introspection. I want to be able to call it like it is, and I want to be able to look at some hard things. And I expect that we would face those own deficiencies in our own lives because we all have them, and to be able to grow from that. Number two, you are spiritual men and women who love Jesus and can see the spiritual implications of these lessons. I don't need to quote scripture on every verse, and I don't need to make practical application. Number one, because it's not a sermon. And number two, because you are quite capable to make those applications yourself. Time does not allow us to delve into the practical scriptural application to each of these principles. Number three, you are open to the simplest of concepts and will seek a minimum of one transformational truth. In other words, everybody should be able to take something away from these 3 days that we're sharing together. And number four, you are committed to walk a journey of excellence and take others with you. It's pointless to be here today learning this stuff if you're not going to take others on your leadership journey and start leading leaders like we talked about in the last session, instead of just leading followers. Here's today's pain quote. Most individuals believe that their perception of reality is actually accurate. It's not. Every one of us has biases and deficiencies. A true leader knows this and adapts his way of thinking to accommodate it. Failure to change the patterns in which we think is detrimental to organizational or personal advancement. Leaders who think they have original thoughts or that they are smarter than the next guy are arrogant and naive. I refuse to work with this type of leader. Once one understands they are clueless, they are well positioned for great leadership. I love that. And it touches on the reality that I want to get to today, is that we do think in locked patterns and we need to do everything we can to break out of those patterns. So here's my premise for today. The general consensus is that entrepreneurial thinking is a gift given only to a select few. However, creative thought is both God-honoring and a skill that can be learned. The leader that acknowledges the difficulty of changing their thought patterns has taken the first step in learning to think creatively. So here's what I want you to do. Everybody stand up real quick. Let's get the blood flowing, stand up, stretch, do what you need to do. Now, for those of you that are listening on the internet, we're going to do a little exercise here to kind of mind tweak the crowd, but we'll be back right afterwards and continue on with the lesson. Okay, so we're back from the object lesson where I performed something with my arms and the audience didn't understand how I did it. The point there for the audience was there are things that you don't know, and those things are detrimental to you as a leader. So I want to explore what's called the Johari window, and this is a 4-quadrant matrix that was created by, believe it or not, a guy named Joe and a guy named Harry. So it's called the Johari window, or Johari window, you'll hear it from time to time. It's most commonly known as the quadrants of knowledge. If you take two axes, the first axis being from low knowledge to high knowledge, and you cross it with another axis from low awareness to high awareness, you get 4 quadrants of knowledge. It creates 4 quadrants. And I want to unpack each of those quadrants with you and talk about each one and why it's important to realize what these quadrants are and how they apply to your own leadership and your own thought and your own knowledge base. So think about awareness and knowledge, all right? The first quadrant, Q1, are those things that you know that you know. Because this is the quadrant where you work proficiently. You know that you know these things. Everyone in this room knows the Bible well. So you are proficient in your craft of sharing the Word of God with other people. You know that you know the Scripture, so you can enter into a situation very confidently, knowing that this is something that you can speak about. This is called the quadrant of confidence. You can have confidence here because you know the subject matter. You have high awareness of your knowledge. The second quadrant is quadrant 2. You know that you don't know. This is the quadrant of trouble. And it's trouble because of this. If you know that you don't know something, then you have absolutely no right to practice in that area. For example, I know that I know nothing about brain surgery. So if I were to perform brain surgery, I'm liable. I enter into the trouble quadrant because I am doing something that my awareness tells me I have no right to do because I have no knowledge there. So we want to avoid that, obviously. Quadrant 3 is the quadrant of surprise. This is what you don't know that you know. How many of you guys in here have been preaching a sermon and something comes out and you're like, whoa, where'd that come from? And you're genuinely surprised because something profound, something very deep came from your mouth. And you would even say today that you learned from yourself because you didn't know that you knew that. It's the quadrant of surprise. This comes with always applying yourself, always dedicating yourself to the craft, forgetting more about a certain subject than most people even know. This is the quadrant of surprise because things come out of here that have been buried deep in your mind or in your subconscious, but they're there. And every once in a while, we get this glimpse of our knowledge because it comes up. This comes through study and application and proficiency in your craft. But here's the main quadrant I want to talk about today, that quadrant of low knowledge and low awareness. Quadrant 4, you don't know that you don't know. This is the quadrant of death. These are the things that are going to kill you. Listen, I always said to my leadership team, I said, guys, tell me what I need to know that I don't know, because the people around you know more than you do. They sense things that you don't sense as the leader. They're privy to people's talking where you're not. People might be afraid to bring something to you, but they're ready to bring it to another. What is the gossip that's going around the church? What are the things you don't know that you don't know? You need to find out what those are. If you have one takeaway, I ask you to go back to your leadership team and say, hey, what don't I know that I don't know? And use that as a regular regimen in your meetings to say every time, hey guys, tell me what I need to know that I don't already know. Because unpacking that knowledge is paramount for a leader. So with that knowledge of these quadrants, particularly the fact that there's a quadrant out there, there are things out there that you don't know that you don't know. I want to talk to you about how that applies to the day in and the day out activities of your own leadership. I want to take you on a journey. We're going to have fun. This is going to be one of the more fun sessions that we do over these 3 days because I want to take you on a journey to show you how your mind works, all right? So I'm going to bring something up with this premise. Your mind makes assumptions, all right? So everybody, you know what this says. It's very clear what this says, right? Somebody tell me. Exactly, jumping to conclusions. You would think that this says jumping to conclusions, but watch this. It says nothing. It's gibberish. Shocking, right? It's because your mind makes assumptions about patterns that you've learned since early childhood. So while you think it says jumping to conclusions, it really doesn't. Let's move on to some other fun stuff. I want you to pick up your smartphone right now and send a text message to 37607. If you're listening on the internet, we're going to do an exercise now where the audience gets to vote on something that they see. I'm going to be pulling that out of the video so that you're not all text messaging me later on. But here for you here today, the instructions are on the screen. Send a text message to that number and put in the message that you see on the screen. All right, now I want you to watch closely. Look up on the screen, you see the words look closely. Keep looking at those words. I'm gonna flash an image up to you and I want you to tell me, vote, that's what the text message is. You're gonna text message your vote, and we're gonna live pull the data here. You're gonna text message your vote to what that image actually was, okay? Here we go, look closely. All right, so what was the card? Was it a king of spades, a queen of diamonds, a king of clubs, a queen of hearts, or something else? Text your vote now. Well, king of spades is obviously winning the game here, followed by king of clubs, and then followed by other. It's interesting that only one voted for a red card. It was obviously a black card. So queen of diamonds gets a vote. No queen of hearts. A couple others, they're still coming in. So king of spades obviously wins the contest. So king of spades. So let's see what the card actually was. None of the above. It is a black king of hearts, which is a card that doesn't even exist. And the reason why so few were able to parse that information is because since early childhood development, you've only learned that a king of hearts is red, or that a black king is either a club or a spade. And so your mind has the literal physiological inability to think outside of the patterns that have burned through your brain since early childhood. We're going to watch a video right now, and I want you to take notes on this video and discuss the aspects in which the one person in the video tells the other person to see beyond what everyone else sees. Take notes about how that might apply to you. For those of you listening online, we're going to drop the videos out. We do that. We don't present the videos online. You'll have to come to an event that I'm speaking at to actually see that portion of it. So for you who are online, we're going to come right back here in just a minute. Okay, so we've come back from a time of discussion about the video. We saw in the video how the first individual encourages the second individual to see beyond what everybody else sees. And so we just had a good discussion time about that. But here's the quote that comes out of that video. See what everyone else chooses not to see out of fear, for conformity, or laziness. See the world anew each day. There's an aspect in which we have to shift into a mindset of seeing things differently before actually being able to see things differently. To almost be skeptical of our own reality, especially when we're trying to think through a problem or fix a situation or change our current reality for the better. We need to see what everyone else chooses not to see out of their own fear. So let's think about thinking. That's kind of weird, right? It's kind of a weird statement, but let's think about thinking. Your mind defaults to pattern thinking. The reason is because brain pathways are solidified early on in life. Edward de Bono does some really good work in here. What de Bono says is that the mind is like a block of jello. And I want you to think through this analogy with me. Think through the mind picture here. If the mind is a block of jello and thoughts are a cup of warm water, and you pour that warm water over the jello, at first, when the jello is very young, when your brain is very young, the warm water runs evenly over the surface of that block of jello. But as time goes on, ruts begin to form to the point where pretty soon the warm water can only run down the ruts that were previously formed because it's cut its way down into the block of jello. This is very much similar to how the brain works. Through early childhood development, we learn patterns, we think in patterns, and patterns are there for a reason, and we're going to talk about that in just a second, the purpose of those patterns. And we are absolutely helpless to think outside of them. I don't know if it's true or apocryphal, but I heard in the Australian outback, there's some signs that say, choose your rut carefully because you're going to be in them for a while. Because out in the outback, the cars drive down the same ruts. And once you get locked into that rut, you can't get out of that rut for many, many miles And so it's a good picture for the brain and for us today. So what's the purpose of this? Why did God create our brains to drive thoughts down these ruts that get cut in our gray matter? Well, the purpose is for safety, normalcy, and productivity. Think about the fight or flight reflex. There are certain things that are cut so deeply in our brain for safety purposes that God created our brain to react instantly and quickly without much thought for our own safety. If you see that a mountain lion is dangerous and you've learned all your life that a mountain lion is dangerous, and you've seen pictures and you've heard news stories over the years of how mountain lions have had encounters with human beings, and you've gone to the zoo and you know what a mountain lion, how ferocious a mountain lion can be, and then you're walking down a path and you encounter a mountain lion, you don't have to think, what kind of animal is that? Kind of tan fur, big paws, big claws, big fangs, evil look on its face. The pattern behavior, even though you've never acted in that way prior, your pattern thoughts immediately indicate that you need to get out of there. And for your safety, you immediately flee. How about normalcy? That's the second purpose, normalcy. We need normalcy in our life. We need to know that we can count on things happening. If A equals B, then C happens. It would be a very dangerous world if the laws of physics didn't exist. It would be a very dangerous world if it, at once, after the fire was on in the stove for half an hour, if once it was cold and once it was hot. We need normalcy in our life. We need to be able to function and have certain expectations that certain things are going to follow in the normalcy, in the patterned aspects of our lives. Otherwise, we would be psychologically messed up if things were always changing around us. We need that normalcy. And then lastly, productivity. The Industrial Revolution taught us that we need normalcy. We need to know that elements, people, and processes all respond similarly, because without that, we can't produce. We can't have production lines. We can't go to work every day. We can't function in a greater economic system because we would not be able to rely on our brains to give us the same results every single time. Now think about that. Although those deep patterned behaviors create safety, normalcy, and productivity, they don't provide creative thought. Creative thought has to break out of that realm. And creative thought can be disruptive, dangerous, abnormal, but it can also be amazing. It can bring us into new territory that we would have otherwise never been able to enter. I want to take you back with me quite a few years to one of those epiphany moments that you have in your life from time to time. If you know anything about me and my family, we love to travel. Travel is a family high value, so we save for that every single year and we travel faithfully. And once a year, I try to go on an adventure trip just by myself. Something my wife is not into adventure travel, and so I try to go out there, just me and God, and basically dig for leadership lessons, exposing myself to a culture that forces me to problem solve and to learn beyond a language and to navigate areas and places that I'm disfamiliar with. I've found that hones my skills, my people skills, my thinking, and it spurs a lot of creative thought that I can then filter back through my leadership thinking and come up with new ideas that make me a better leader. So here I am years ago in Nazca, in the Atacama Desert, Peru. The higher part of the desert is in the Nazca area, and it's famous for the Nazca lines. I'm sure you've heard of the Nazca lines. They're these ancient lines drawn by ancient people on this plateau in Nazca. Well, this was one of those moments. I rented a private plane, chartered a plane to take me up over the line so I could see the lines from the air. And in this picture, you'll notice that there's three distinct areas. First of all, there's the hummingbird there, which is the most famous of the Nazca lines, a beautiful piece of art that's centuries old, drawn by ancient peoples. And then next to them are the ancient landing strips. That's what they're called, the landing strips or the landing lines, because if you're familiar with Chariot of the Gods and Van Danken's book, he was a bit of a wacko, but he believed that aliens came down and helped these ancient peoples to draw these lines and et cetera, et cetera. So moving on past there, you see we're on the plateau with the hummingbird and the landing strips. And then on the edge, you see I highlighted it here, is where the erosion takes place off the side of the plateau. And it was just a moment for me to see, you know what, De Bono was right. Once the water travels off that plateau, there's only one place it goes. It goes into those ruts that have been previously carved. Yet, I loved the contrast here because there are lines naturally drawn by erosion, but you come up above those ruts and you get creative expression also in lines. And it was such a beautiful picture to me in that moment about what De Bono said about the mind and the process and how difficult it is to rise above the ruts in our own brains and to think creatively and to create and to be inspired with new leadership. So I want to take us on a fun little journey here with some puzzles. Because what I want to do is I want to show you how those patterns are engraved deeply into you and start to give you a glimpse on how you get out of those patterns. So here's the first puzzle. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Correct. Everybody in the room got 100% on that exam. Everybody said 50. Why? It's because you learned these mathematical patterns as a child, and because of that, you don't even have to think about the answer to this. It comes naturally. 50. Let's try it again with a little bit more complex data set. This is a simple data set. It presents itself really easily, but even with slightly more complex data, it's even possible. Let's try it again. A, E, I, O, U. Exactly. Everybody in the room got, yeah, and sometimes Y. Someone said, and sometimes Y. That's funny. A-E-I-O-U. Exactly right. Everybody in the room got 100% on that exam as well. And even though that was a slightly more complex data set, there's no rhyme or reason to how each letter follows each letter, but the pattern was learned early in life and will never be forgotten. So we can conclude this, that we find it nearly impossible to think beyond patterned information. Now that we see how deeply these patterns are grooved into our brain, so much so that we don't even have to think about it, I want to start introducing more complex data. Because we find it nearly impossible to think beyond patterned information, and I want to show you that. But like I said earlier, I also want to show you that we can begin to see glimpses of how we nudge ourselves out of there through these next exercises I'm going to give to you. 15, 30, 45. That's right. Everybody said 45. Now, you're wrong. Every single person in this room just got a 0 on this test. But now you're thinking, what could be different? What changes the pattern? How does this pattern change? What other patterns does this fit that we initially didn't think about? Obviously, the immediate answer is 45 because that's ingrained in you. But it takes some more thought to get out of that pattern and say, what other patterns does this fit? Well, I can give you a word and you will understand this pattern. One word. But that's because I'm adding data. So think about how your brain is working at that point. Right now, you don't know what the answer is. You need another clue to find the answer. If I said the word tennis, yeah, exactly. Everybody says 40, right? Because now tennis adds data to the data set, and now 15, 30, 40 makes sense where it didn't before. Now the key to thinking creatively is not being given the word, it's arriving at the word. So we're going to talk in our next session about problem solving and some of the tools that bring us to that next level of being able to unpack these things and figure out beyond the pattern. But right now I'm establishing with you that these patterns are very hard to break. So we can see even through the 15, 30, 40 exercise that we naturally solve problems with small data sets. But 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, A, E, I, O, U, those are not complex. Running an organization, running a church gets very complex. So you have to be able to gauge others and a bunch of different tools to begin to think outside of your normal realm of thinking, because you will never be able to do it when you have a complex data set. I'm going to add a little more complexity now. And the purpose of these next exercises is so you can actually see how your brain shifts its thought patterns and be encouraged by that, knowing that later on in your leadership, you're going to have to do that at a much greater scale. So let's look at this next exercise. What shape does not fit the pattern? The circle, right? Everybody got 100% on the test. The circle does not fit the pattern. Why? Because our mind immediately tells us the square has straight lines, the pentagon has straight lines, the circle has rounded lines. So our brain is able to say that the circle does not fit the pattern. Now, here's what I want you to see, because I'm going to change things up. I want you to think, remember we said think about thinking? I want you to think about the shifts your brain makes to readjust your pattern. Here we go. Now, which shape doesn't fit? The A, right? Everybody agrees that the A doesn't fit. And that's because the A is more specific than the other three patterns, right? You've got three shapes and you've got a letter. So now the letter doesn't fit. I suppose you could argue that the circle still doesn't fit because it's the only one with rounded lines. However, the A is far more complex and it has semiotic meaning to us, right? So we know that the A represents something, whereas the other shapes do not necessarily represent anything in particular. So our minds can easily now group the circle, which was before the outcast, in now with the other shapes and sequester the A as the shape that does not fit the pattern. Now let's go one more round. Which shape doesn't fit the pattern? Now it's the square because it's black, right? So it is distinctly different than the other three. The other three have as a common trait the orange color, and the black stands out. Now think about how your mind has been able to jump the ruts of understanding. That's a very simple process, but what we're asking you to do in organizational leadership is to jump ruts with very complex problems. And that's why the third session this evening is so necessary. Come back for the problem-solving session, session 3. But before you leave today, I want to leave you with one final exercise just to help you think through problem solving and get a taste of what is to come. With complex data, it's far more difficult to force jump pattern thinking. Now here's a takeaway for you. A single mind is insufficient. We talk about solving these simple problems, but when we talk about solving problems as complex as leading an organization, you must have more than one mind on the problem. It's always better to have multiple minds at a task, because a single mind is stuck in a single experience with single presuppositions and single patterns. A multitude of minds pulls from a multitude of arenas, a multitude of life experiences, and a multitude of presuppositions and patterned thinking that may be different than your own. 2 minds will always be better than 1. 3 better than 2, 4 better than 3, etc., etc. As you endeavor on organizational leadership and organizational renewal and organization transformation, you must have a multitude of counsel. So let me leave you with this final problem. Down there in your notes, you'll see a box with 9 dots in it. I want you to connect all the dots with 4 straight lines without lifting your pen from the paper. Now, if you know this exercise, please don't do it right now, because I don't want somebody who doesn't know it to see your paper and then you shortcut their creative process. We need everyone who's never seen this puzzle to work through this puzzle and try to solve it, if it's solvable at all. So if you know it, hold off on solving it. And we'll come back in just a minute to talk about it. Okay, we're back. So I'm going to put the answer on the board. 4 straight lines without lifting the pen. You have to go outside the border or outside the box. How many of you could not do it because your mind had erected the box and you couldn't go outside of the box to connect the lines. That's an early pattern behavior. You and I both know Grandma used to tell us to color inside the lines. Mom and Dad used to color, don't go outside the lines when you color with your crayons. Some of us even highlighted with the crayon real thick inside the line and then colored in between. It's a pattern that we learned early on, is that we can't, if there's an apparent box, we can't move outside of it. And what I'm telling you today is you need to move outside of it. Get outside the lines, paint outside, paint off of the canvas. That's where creative thinking starts. So let me leave you with this question. If our mind is so restricted and limited by years of pattern learning, how can we hope to break out and find new solutions? Well, that's why you have to come back to session 3 this evening and learn some problem-solving techniques to help you think through and think outside of the ruts that are cut through your gray matter. So we're going to move now to questions and answers. We have about 10 minutes now that we can do that. And if you're listening on the internet, we're going to end here. But if you have questions or comments, feel free to email me or visit my website, curtis.net, curtis.net, or my YouTube channel. You can subscribe on my YouTube channel, which is /Rick B. Curtis. Thank you and God bless.